Just take a moment, if you will, to imagine taking that soft, plush mattress of yours and tucking it inside a great wooden washing machine, then turning that dial all the way up to the highest spin, and quietly whispering to yourself that this is surely the most peaceful night's rest a soul could ask for. It sounds quite mad, doesn't it? But that very same wild tumble was exactly what those sailors of old lived through every single night of their lives upon the sea. These days, we have become such pampered folk of the dry land, finding it hard to sleep if our pillow moves but a hair's breadth, or letting the tiny buzz of a fly set our hearts aflutter. And yet those brave men of the past slept deep in the belly of a vessel whose wooden bones groaned and screamed in their struggle against the deep, tossed about on the crest of the waves as lightly as a feather caught in a gale. The cold salt spray would find its way in, trickling down over their weary faces as they lay tucked in their swaying hammocks. This evening, you and I shall walk together down those slick and narrow stairs, descending into the shadows of the lower hold, where the heavy perfume of tar and sea salt lingers thick in the air. We shall see for ourselves how those beds, hanging there in the darkness, became perhaps the finest invention the world of sleep has ever known. And we shall learn how a sailor could rest there, suspended in the air like a butterfly in its cocoon, even while the great ship around him felt as though it were turning quite upside down, yet never once would he tumble to the floor. We are going to find a peculiar secret hidden within this giant wooden cradle of the deep, and we'll discover how the thunderous sound of the waves was the only lullaby that ever graced their heavy eyes.
But before a stray wave manages to find us and dampen our spirits, why don't you settle in and make your presence known among us, and perhaps stay a while longer to sail upon this restless ocean of ours? Now, my friend, just reach out and hold fast to a piece of rope if you need to, and let us let ourselves sink slowly into the quiet of sleep. Let us put aside the thought of our steady beds that stay exactly where we put them, moving only when we choose to turn. Instead, let us drift away to that wild world of wood and hemp they called a ship, down to the lower deck where the men gathered to rest, a place they called the sleeping quarters, though in truth it was more like a great dark tin of sardines, filled with scents that a person today could hardly imagine. In those long-ago days, a simple sailor didn't have the fine luxury of picking out a room with a view of the blue horizon. No, he was pressed together with 100 or maybe even 200 of his fellows in a tiny, crowded space, beneath a ceiling so very low that if a man were to lift his head too fast, he'd find it meeting a solid beam of oak, either waking him right up or sending him back into a deep, dreamless slumber. Within that small, tight corner of the world, the air was thick and damp, filled with a strong and heavy mix of smells like thick black tar, the old seawater pooling at the bottom of the ship, and, naturally, the unmistakable scent of many weary men who hadn't felt the touch of a proper bath since they sailed away from the harbor 3 long months before. The true somber humor of our life at sea reveals itself when the sky turns gray and the great storm begins to roar. In that moment, when the deep waters lose their patience, our mighty vessel is reduced to nothing more than a child's plaything, tossed to and fro by the towering white-capped waves.
The decks beneath our feet tilt at such sudden, steep angles that the very idea of walking becomes a distant dream, and the ancient timber walls groan and shriek with a weary, frightening sound, as though the wood itself might surrender and crumble away at any second. Yet in the very heart of all this wild confusion, a weary sailor is expected to find his rest. It is then that we look to a clever little invention, something that has saved many a man's back from breaking against the hard oak, the humble canvas hammock. It is but a simple, sturdy length of heavy cloth, held up by ropes at either end and fastened tightly to the beams of the low ceiling. To a landsman, it might look like nothing more than a child's swing, but in the strange, shifting world of the sea, it is a small marvel of careful thought and design. While the ship might roll and pitch with a violent suddenness from side to side, the man tucked away in his little canvas cocoon stays perfectly still, held right in the center of things. The whole world of the ship dances and heaves around him, yet there he hangs in the air, drifting as if he were inside a quiet bubble, quite untouched by the pull of the earth. Close your eyes and picture that strange sight. Hundreds of those hammocks hanging side by side in the dim light, all swaying together in a single, slow rhythm, just like the great pendulum of a grandfather clock. The men inside are wrapped up tight, like ancient mummies, letting themselves go entirely to that long, forced dance of the sea. If a soul had tried to lay himself down on the cold, hard floor, he would have been sent rolling like a heavy barrel of oil from one side of the hold to the other with every passing wave, and his poor bones would have been broken to splinters long before the first light of morning touched the deck. And so drifting there in the air was the only way to escape the constant bruising of the wooden walls.
But you mustn't think these swinging beds were a paradise, for they were far from it. The little bit of room given to each man was scarcely wider than his own weary shoulders. We all slept so very close together that if one man happened to sneeze, the vibration would shiver through the entire long row of hammocks. And if the fellow hanging right beside you decided to turn in his sleep, you would likely find his elbow pressed hard into your ribs, a sort of painful, crowded brotherhood that none of us could ever truly escape. Ah, they laid their heads down to rest in the middle of a never-ending noise, you see. The sound of the great waves lashing and pounding against the ship's wooden side was ever so close to their tired ears, with only a few thin inches of oak keeping them from the deep, dark water. To those poor souls, the roar of the sea sounded for all the world like a wild beast, scratching and clawing at the walls, hungry to find a way inside. And yet, because they were so very weary from the heavy work of hauling on rough ropes and hoisting up those great sails, a sailor would sink into a sleep as deep as the ocean itself the moment he tumbled into his swaying hammock, letting the ship toss and turn him however it wished. When all was said and done, he was not but a traveler in a floating box of wood, left with nothing to do but close his eyes and dream of the firm, quiet earth that stayed still beneath a man's feet. Now, let's speak for a moment about the sailor's true enemy, which wasn't the shark in the deep or the storm in the sky, but time itself. In these days of ours, we set our little clocks for 7 in the morning, and we grumble, asking for just a few minutes more, feeling quite put upon if we don't get our full 8 hours of rest without interruption. But on those old wooden ships, the very idea of sleeping straight through the night was a tired old joke that brought no smiles, for the ship was a living thing that never once paused or closed its eyes. Because of this, the men were bound to a hard way of living called the watches, which ruled their every hour. The law of the sea was a strict one, allowing only 4 hours at a stretch. Yes, it was 4 long hours of back-breaking toil, pulling at the lines and fighting the waves, followed by 4 short hours of rest, and then back to work for another 4, continuing on that way until the journey was over, or their time in this world was done. This meant that just as the poor sailor laid his head down in that canvas sling, and just as his tired, aching body started to let go of its many pains, and just as he began to dream of a warm supper in his mother's kitchen, a sudden, thunderous noise would break the quiet and shake him to his very soul. You see, they weren't woken by a soft word or the sweet singing of birds in the trees. No, it was the work of a most difficult man, known as the boatswain. This fellow would stomp into the dark sleeping quarters with a brass whistle held tight in his teeth, letting out a sound so sharp and piercing it felt like a needle in the ear, a noise loud enough to rouse the dead from their resting places, all while shouting and hollering for every man to jump up and get himself above deck immediately. There wasn't a moment to spare for lying there or rubbing the sleep from one's eyes. If a man was even a second too slow, he might find himself tasting the sting of a knotted rope across his back. And that, my friend, is where the sad and strange muddle would truly begin. Being woken up wasn't even the hardest part of it all. No, the real misery was in putting on one's clothes.
When that sailor had gone to his rest only 4 hours before, he had peeled off his heavy wool and leather garments, all soaked through with the freezing salt spray, and set them down nearby. Now he had to pull those very same clothes back on, and they were still dripping wet, cold to the touch, and smelling of the damp and the rot of the sea. Just try to imagine, if you will, the feeling of taking a sock soaked in ice-cold water and pulling it over your warm skin, all while you're still swaying and stumbling from the heavy weight of your own sleepiness. They would begin that slow climb up the creaking wooden ladders, moving for all the world like shadows or men walking in their dreams, their poor eyes heavy and half closed against the world.
Their weary bodies would shiver and shake from the biting cold and the sudden sharp sting of those damp clothes against their skin as they stepped out into the deep velvet blackness of the night to face the salt spray of the great waves that would come leaping up to meet them, slapping against their cheeks with a cold and unyielding hand. In those moments, they had to pull themselves awake, truly awake, for even the smallest slip of a knot or a moment's drifting while gripping the great wooden rider could spell the end for the ship and every soul she carried down into the deep. You see, they had no warm tea or coffee to clear their minds. Only the sharp spike of fear and the rush of their own blood through their veins served to chase away the lingering ghosts of sleep. And when at last that long, heavy watch of 4 hours, a time that felt as long as an entire lifetime, finally came to its end, the poor sailor would scramble back toward those dark sleeping quarters as fast as his tired legs could carry him, desperate just to win back a few precious moments of quiet. He would cast his bone-weary body into the swaying hammock, often still clad in those sodden, heavy garments, because he was simply too spent to do anything else, and he would fall into a deep, dreamless state in an instant. He knew in his heart, of course, that in what felt like only a blink of an eye, the shrill, sharp call of the boatswain's whistle would come piercing through the air again, starting that endless cycle of toil all over once more, a cycle that wouldn't find its end until his feet finally touched the solid, steady earth of the shore. They took their sleep in little, painful fragments, snatching tiny pieces of dreams from the very jaws of the hungry sea, living a life where the sweet taste of a full night's rest was something they could only imagine.
Now, if you were to think that the troubles of these weary sailors ended with the biting cold and the hunger for sleep, well, you're far more hopeful than I. For the true hardship wasn't just the waves thumping against the hull from the outside. No, the real trial lay with the uninvited guests who lived right there inside the ship with them. The very second the hold grew a little quiet and heavy eyelids began to drop, those little creatures who never paid a lick of rent would begin to stir. Great, giant rats they were, creatures who truly believed the ship belonged to them, and that the sailors were nothing more than passing visitors in their wooden home. These weren't the shy, skittish things you might find in a barn on land, oh no. These were seasoned sea rats, strong and bold beyond words, scurrying without a care over the thick ropes, across the swaying hammocks, and even wandering right over the faces of the men as they tried to rest. A sailor might find himself jolted awake in the dark of the night, not from a bad dream, but because the king of the rats had decided that the man's nose was the perfect little bridge to get to the other side of the cabin, or perhaps because he felt the soft, delicate brush of whiskers tickling against his ear. In that thick darkness, the sailor would just slowly brush his hand across his face, weary and beyond caring, and then drift right back off to sleep. He'd reached such a point of exhaustion that he'd made a quiet sort of peace with those little beasts. They would nibble on whatever scraps of dry biscuit he had left, and he, in turn, would do his very best not to accidentally catch one of them in his teeth in the shadows. And it wasn't just the little creatures with 4 legs that shared those cramped quarters, for there was a vast, silent army of tiny things too.
Cockroaches and fleas lived deep within the cracks of the aged timber, just waiting for the gentle warmth of a human body to coax them out for their nightly wanderings. In his rest, the sailor would find himself scratching at his skin, his fingers moving with a quiet, instinctive rhythm, as if he were softly plucking the strings of an instrument in his dreams. There was a bit of a grim old joke they used to tell, a rough sort of humor, born of necessity, that a man of the sea never needed to go looking for a bite to eat at night. All he had to do was lie back and keep his mouth open while he drifted off,
and a bit of free nourishment would eventually tumble down from the beams above. It was a whole world of busy, crawling life, playing out every single moment in every corner of that crowded, dark hold. And you must add to that little circus of animals a different kind of burden, a trouble of the sea they called the leakage. You see, those wooden ships, no matter how carefully they were crafted by the master's hand, were really just planks of wood bound together and set to float upon the deep. When the waves grew restless and moved with a heavy strength, the wood would groan and stretch, and the tiny gaps between the beams would begin to let the sea seep in. It wasn't the sort of leak that would send a ship to the ocean floor, but it was a wearying thing. Cold, salt-heavy drops falling with a slow and steady beat from the ceiling, right onto a man's weary brow. Drip, 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 it went. A slow and patient sort of trial that felt like the quiet torment they say was once given to prisoners. Soon enough, the very bedding would turn into a damp and heavy place, like a cold swamp clinging to the skin. That sailor would close his eyes, knowing that a drop of water was waiting for him, that a rat was watching him from the shadows, and that the bed beneath him was soaked through. And yet, he would sleep.
He would sleep with a depth that might make even a king jealous, for his tired body had simply decided to turn off the light in his mind, ignoring the smells, the sounds, the dampness, and those little uninvited visitors. He fell into a state of sweet, heavy forgetfulness that meant he wouldn't feel a thing, even if the ship itself were to break apart in the night. It was a rest woven from the cloth of his own suffering, but it was the only thing that came for free on that long and weary journey. Now, let us speak a moment of the air, if one could truly call it that, for it was a far cry from the sweet, salt-kissed breeze of the open deck. Down there in those deep, dark holes, tucked away far beneath the rolling waves, there were no windows to throw open to the sky, and no narrow shafts to welcome the cool breath of the ocean into that hidden world. Instead, the space was like a box, sealed tight against the world, where the quiet sighs and heavy breaths of hundreds of weary souls gathered and lingered in the gloom. As the long hours of the night drifted by, the very air began to change, thickening into a warm and heavy mist, a dense vapor so sluggish that the little oil lamps swaying from the beams would flicker and die out, not because their oil had run dry, but because they simply could not find the strength to burn in such a stifling place. A man would draw in that tired air that had already passed through the lungs of many others before reaching him, and he would feel a strange, slow heaviness take hold of his limbs, a gentle yet dizzying fog that clouded his mind. His dreams would wander into odd and ghostly places, turning into quiet hallucinations and long, shadowed nightmares, born from the simple hunger for a single, clean breath. When the morning light finally found him, he would wake with a dull and heavy ache behind his eyes, a throbbing like the rhythmic strike of an iron hammer. Though it wasn't the motion of the sea that pained him, it was the slow, nightly toll of that airless chamber, a place as dark and stifling as the forgotten tombs of ancient kings, particularly when the ship found itself drifting through those golden, sweltering tropical waters, where the hold became a furnace of quiet suffering, and the heat seemed to seep deep into the very marrow of a man's tired bones. And then, to make the suffering complete, there was the noise, a never-ending and peculiar sort of music that only added to the heavy weight of our shared misery. You must try to picture 100 weary souls, men with noses blocked by winter chills or crooked from old brawls, some struggling for breath with the asthma, all of them falling into slumber at once and letting loose a frightening chorus of snores, rising and falling in every pitch you could imagine. One fellow would whistle thin and high like a boiling kettle, while another might growl deep in his chest like a wounded lion in the tall grass. A third would make those sudden choking gasps that made you fear he was drawing his very last breath on this earth, and a fourth would be muttering away in his sleep, calling out imaginary orders to a crew that wasn't there, until all these sounds joined together into a roar that drowned out even the howling gale outside the wooden hull. In that world of sound, there was no such thing as a quiet corner to call your own, and privacy was a thing forgotten by every tired man. You didn't just listen to the man beside you snoring. You felt your own hammock tremble and sway with every great shuddering snort he let out into the dark. And if the poor soul was burdened with a common cold, you might find yourself catching a bit of his sneezing spray while you were drifted off in a deep sleep. A most unpleasant and unavoidable way to be tangled up with your fellow man. Harder still were those long nights when a man's belly simply couldn't make peace with the ship's rancid salt food, and you'd hear the heavy groans and the turning of his gut echoing through the gloom of the hold, a sure sign to us all that the hours would be very long indeed, and the air would turn from merely foul to something truly unbearable. Yet, despite the stifling air, the terrible noise, and the smells that felt strong enough to melt the very iron of the ship, those sailors slept on, not because they found any comfort there, but because their poor bodies were simply giving way, surrendering themselves completely, and losing consciousness in a great silent escape from the world they lived in. They would sink deep into the damp sweat and the shadows, their bodies swaying gently to and fro with the motion of the ship, for all the world like still figures in a floating tomb, only to be stirred by the sharp cry of duty or the sudden shadow of a coming disaster. It was a sight that showed just how much a human spirit can endure in its struggle to adapt, where the simple act of falling asleep in a crowded, reeking oven becomes the greatest wish a man could have, a blessing reserved only for the very lucky few. On the quietest of nights, my boy, the hammock would rock ever so softly from side to side, just like a little babe's cradle in a still room. But when the great deep decided to show its teeth and a true gale came howling in, why, those sleeping quarters turned into a wild and confusing place where the very laws of the world seemed to slip away. The old vessel didn't merely rock, it would leap and dive and tilt at such frightening slants that the walls became the floor beneath you and the floor above you became the sky. It was then that a sailor would learn the darker side of that clever hammock. You see, the ropes kept him steady and level enough, but it was the ship itself that went mad, rushing all about him until the wooden bulkheads seemed to be charging right at him to strike him down. Just picture yourself drifting off to sleep as peaceable as can be, and then all at once you see the ceiling rushing down at your tired face with a terrible speed, like a heavy press coming to crush the life from you, only for it to pull away as the floor rises up to meet you in a strange and fearful game that simply would not end. A sailor had to master a peculiar way of resting, huddling up small in a defensive way, with his knees tucked to his chest and his arms shielding his poor head, all to keep from crashing into the heavy beams or the heads of his mates, who were swinging there beside him like the pendulums of a clock gone quite mad. You would hear the dull thud of bone against timber and the salt-crusted curses that followed every time a great wave slammed against the ship's side. And the danger wasn't just in the rocking, you see. It came from things flying through the air, too. In the middle of that swirling storm, anything not lashed down tight became as dangerous as a cannonball in flight. Those heavy sea chests where the men kept all they owned in this world would go sliding and scraping across the tilted floor with a sound that would chill your bones. Thick leather boots would take flight, sailing through the dark like little missiles. Wooden bowls, tin spoons, and even the poor rats would lose their footing, falling from the rafters above like a soft, dark rain. And so a man would try to sleep, all the while waiting for a heavy boot to knock him senseless, or a sliding chest to crack his leg while he hung there, suspended in the empty air. Above all that wild motion was the sound of the ship's own heart breaking. The ancient timber, pressed so hard by the weight of the sea, would let out such groans and creaks and sharp cracks that it sounded like a living thing in great pain, as if the very bones of the vessel were being pulled apart. Every man there slept with one eye halfway open in the blackness, listening close to tell one sound from another. Was that the mast snapping, or a plank letting go, or was it just the familiar, weary moaning of their old home? Such a heavy weight on the mind made the very idea of sleep seem like a foolish thing, and yet they did sleep. They slept because to stay awake was to let the madness in. They drifted off in the middle of that wooden earthquake, just like little children in a cradle,
giving themselves over entirely to whatever fate awaited them there in the belly of that great restless beast of the sea. After many long months of that daily hardship, the broken rest, and that heavy air thick with the scent of brine and rot, there finally comes that hour every sailor longs for in his heart, the moment he steps off the gangplank and feels the solid earth beneath his boots once more. You would think, wouldn't you, that they would scurry off to the nearest soft bed and slumber for a week, and in truth, many tried to do just that. But there is a curious thing, a strange and wonderful irony that visits them on that very first night ashore. Instead of drifting into a deep, peaceful sleep, they find themselves caught in the grip of what we call land sickness.
You see, their weary bodies, their minds, and every nerve in them had grown so used to the constant heaving and the violent shaking of the hull that a bed that stands perfectly still feels quite wrong, almost unbearably dull. The sailor home from the sea stretches out on a soft, dry, clean mattress in a room that doesn't move, yet he feels a peculiar dizziness, a feeling that the four walls are spinning round him, or perhaps a deep, gnawing worry, because the silence is so very loud. He has spent a lifetime listening to the mighty roar of the waves, the mournful creak of the old timbers, and the rhythmic snoring of his brothers in the hold. Now this heavy silence makes him startle, his eyes snapping open in the dark every few minutes, for he fears the ship has gone still because it is foundering. It was so strange for some of those old salts that they simply could not sleep in a proper bed. They would go out into the garden and string up a hammock between two trees, just so they could feel that familiar sway, that sweet sensation of being cradled between the earth and the high heavens. The great wide sea had taken from them forevermore the simple comfort of things that stay still. But let us leave those brave, tired souls to their struggle with the quiet of the land, and let us look to you instead. Yes, you, my friend, listening to my voice as you lie there in your own quiet kingdom. Take a moment to look about and think on the quiet blessings you are wrapped in, though you might not always notice them. You are resting on solid ground that does not tip or tremble. There is no rogue wave waiting to crash against the wall of your room, no heavy crates sliding across the floor to bruise your limb, no stray rat to scurry across your face, and no harsh whistle to wake you in an hour's time to pull on damp clothes and face the biting cold.